The unwelcome visitor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of Sterling Enterprises' 52nd floor as Victoria Sterling stepped from the private elevator, her designer heels clicking with military precision. Merger with Blackstone Industries would cement her position as the youngest CEO to broker a billion-dollar deal in the company's history. Everything had to be perfect. She paused outside the executive conference room, adjusting her navy blazer, and checking her reflection in the gleaming brass nameplate that read Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. Through the frosted glass doors, she could make out the silhouette of someone already inside. Her assistant hadn't mentioned any early arrivals. Victoria pushed open the doors with authority, expecting to find James Crawford or one of the other board members reviewing last-minute documents. Instead, she discovered an elderly man in a worn gray uniform sitting quietly at the far end of the mahogany table, his weathered hands folded peacefully in his lap. Marcus Webb, the night janitor. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The man didn't flinch, didn't scramble to his feet with apologies as she expected. He simply looked up at her with tired but gentle brown eyes. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile corporate environment. "Don't good morning me. You have no business being in this room." Victoria's anger flared as she noticed. His cleaning cart was nowhere to be seen. This is a restricted area. The merger meeting starts in 30 minutes, and I will not have some janitor contaminating the space with his presence. Marcus remained seated, unmoved by her harsh words. "I understand you're busy, but if I could just have a moment to explain." "There's nothing to explain." Victoria's voice rose as she pulled out her phone. "Security will escort you out immediately. Consider your employment terminated." Other executives began filtering into the room. James Crawford with his silver hair perfectly groomed, Patricia Hong clutching her leather portfolio, and several others who stopped short when they witnessed the confrontation. Victoria felt their eyes on her, measuring her response to this unprecedented situation. "Ma'am, with respect," Marcus said, slowly rising to his feet, "I'm not trespassing. I have every right to be here." The audacity of his statement sent a flush of heat up Victoria's neck. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. This was exactly the kind of disruption she couldn't afford. Not today, right? "You're a janitor." "You're right." "Extends to emptying trash bins and mopping floors. Nothing more." "Right." She gestured toward the door with sharp movements. "Security is on their way up. I suggest you leave before they arrive and spare yourself further embarrassment." Marcus stood quietly for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something in his expression, not defiance, but a deep sadness that made Victoria's chest tighten unexpectedly. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. "Your father would be disappointed in the woman you've become." The room fell completely silent. Victoria felt as though she'd been struck. How dare this man, this nobody, invoke her father's memory? Robert Sterling had built this company from nothing, and she had fought every day since his death 5 years ago to prove herself worthy of his legacy. "Get out!" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "Get out before I call the police." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. As he walked toward the door, passing the frozen board members, he paused beside Victoria's chair. "Made him a promise," he said quietly. "I've kept it every year since he passed. Today marks 5 years, and I wasn't about to break it now." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Victoria standing in stunned silence as 20 pairs of eyes watched her every move. Echoes of the past the merger meeting proceeded like clockwork, but Victoria found herself distracted by Marcus's parting words. Despite closing the Blackstone deal successfully, his quiet declaration about a promise haunted her thoughts. As the last board member filed out, congratulating her on the acquisition, Victoria remained seated at the head of the mahogany table, staring at the spot where the old janitor had sat so peacefully. "Impressive work today," James Crawford said, lingering by the door, "though I must say that incident this morning was rather unusual." "Do you know what the man meant about a promise?" Victoria shook her head curtly. "Probably some delusional fantasy. Maintenance staff sometimes develop inappropriate attachments to the executives they see regularly. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. Marcus hadn't seemed delusional. He'd seemed certain. After James left, Victoria found herself alone with her thoughts. She pulled out her phone and dialed security. "This is Victoria." "Sterling, I need information about Marcus Webb, night janitor." "How long has he been employed here?" "Let me check. Ms. Sterling." The security chief's voice came through the speaker after a moment. "Marcus Webb has been with the company for 23 years, hired in 2002 by your father, actually. Impeccable record. Never missed a day. No complaints, no incidents. Model employee. 23 years. Victoria set down her phone with trembling fingers. That would mean her father hired Marcus when she was just 15, during the darkest period of their family's life. Her mother had died the year before, leaving Robert Sterling to raise a rebellious teenager while struggling to keep his fledgling company afloat. Victoria's mind drifted back to those difficult years. She remembered how her father would work late into the night, often sleeping in his office, rather than coming home to their modest apartment. Money had been tight, so tight that she'd worn the same 3 outfits to school for months, enduring the whispered comments from classmates who came from wealthier families. But somehow, miraculously, when it came time for college applications, her father had surprised her with news of a full scholarship to Princeton. "Anonymous donor," he'd said with a mysterious smile. "Someone believes in your potential, sweetheart. Don't waste this opportunity." She had never questioned it, too grateful and excited to look deeper into the gift that would change her life forever. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, room and board, even books and spending money. It had seemed too good to be true, but the documentation was legitimate. Processed through a small foundation she'd never heard of. Victoria walked to the floor 2 ceiling windows overlooking the city, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. If her father hadn't been entirely truthful about that scholarship, what if Marcus Webb somehow... No, she whispered to herself. That's impossible, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She thought about Marcus's gentle demeanor, the way he'd spoken her father's name with such reverence and familiarity. Most employees who had worked for the company during her father's era spoke of Robert Sterling with professional respect. But Marcus had mentioned him with the tone of someone who had known him personally. Victoria returned to her desk and opened her laptop, accessing the company's personnel files. Marcus Webb's employment record was exactly as security had described: 23 years of perfect attendance, glowing performance reviews, and salary increases that barely kept pace with inflation. His emergency contact listed a daughter, Rosa Webb, on an address in Queens. But it was his hiring date that made Victoria's breath catch. March 15th, 2002. Just 2 months before her father had surprised her with news of the Princeton scholarship. She scrolled through more files looking for any connection, any clue that might explain Marcus's cryptic words. Hidden in the archived financial records, she found something that made her stomach clench. In 2002, her father had taken out a significant loan against the company. Money that had been repaid gradually over the following 4 years. The timeline was too convenient to be coincidental. Victoria's hands shook as she reached for her phone again, this time calling her father's former secretary, Helen Morrison, who had retired but maintained contact with the family. "Helen, it's Victoria. I need to ask you something about Dad's business dealings in 2002. Do you remember him taking out any unusual loans or making any large payments to individuals?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Victoria, dear, why are you asking about such old matters?" "Please, Helen, it's important." Another pause, then a sigh. "Your father swore me to secrecy, but I suppose it doesn't matter now that they're both gone. He did help someone that year, a janitor whose family was facing eviction. But Victoria, you must understand, your father made me promise never to tell you the details." The phone slipped from Victoria's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the desk. Both gone. Marcus had lost someone too. Through the window, storm clouds were gathering over the city, casting the boardroom into shadow. For the first time in years, Victoria Sterling felt small and uncertain, haunted by the growing realization that everything she thought she knew about her success might be built on a foundation of secrets and sacrifice she had never bothered to uncover. The scholarship secret Victoria spent the remainder of the afternoon in her office, unable to concentrate on the mountain of post-merger paperwork demanding her attention. Helen's words echoed in her mind, both gone. If Marcus had lost someone. Around the same time her father helped his family, it explained the bond she was beginning to suspect existed between the two men. At 7 o'clock, long after the corporate floors had emptied, Victoria made an unprecedented decision. Instead of heading home to her penthouse apartment, she took the elevator down to the building's lower level, where the maintenance offices were located. She had never ventured into this part of Sterling Enterprises before. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows in the narrow hallways lined with supply closets and mechanical rooms. Victoria felt out of place in her designer suit, her heels echoing loudly on the polished concrete floor. She found Marcus sitting alone in the small break room, eating a simple sandwich from a brown paper bag. He looked up as she entered, showing no surprise at her appearance. "Miss Sterling, I wondered if you might come looking for answers." Victoria remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "My father's former secretary mentioned he helped you in 2002. Something about your family facing eviction." Marcus nodded slowly, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please, sit. This story deserves to be told properly." Against her better judgment, Victoria took the offered seat. The plastic chair was uncomfortable, nothing like the ergonomic leather furniture. In her executive suite, 23 years ago, my wife Alina was diagnosed with cancer, Marcus began, his voice steady but weighted with old grief. The medical bills were crushing us. I was working 2 jobs days at a warehouse, nights cleaning office buildings, but it wasn't enough. We fell behind on rent, and our landlord started eviction proceedings. Victoria found herself leaning forward, despite her resolve to remain detached. Alina was scared we'd lose our home while she was fighting for her life. Our daughter Rosa was only 8 years old. I was desperate, willing to do anything to keep my family together. Marcus paused, unwrapping his sandwich with careful precision. "That's when your father found me crying in the stairwell of this very building at 3 in the morning. My father." Victoria's voice was barely audible. Robert Sterling was working late again, as he often did in those early years. He came down personally to check why the security lights were still on in the stairwell. Marcus's eyes grew distant with memory. "Most executives would have called security, had me removed. But your father sat down right there on those concrete steps and listened to my whole story." Victoria tried to imagine her father, always so composed and businesslike, in a stairwell with a janitor, but the image wouldn't form clearly in her mind. The next day, he called me into his office. I thought I was fired. Marcus took a small bite of his sandwich. Instead, he handed me an envelope with enough money to cover our back rent and Elena's medical bills for the next 6 months, he said. It was an advance against future work, but we both knew it was a gift. "But that's not all, is it?" Victoria asked, though she dreaded the answer. Marcus shook his head. "Your father and I started talking regularly after that. He'd find excuses to come down to the floors I was cleaning, just to check how Alina was doing. He learned that Rosa was brilliant in school, but that we had no money saved for her college. That's when he told me about his own struggles, how hard it was raising you alone, worried he was about affording your education." Victoria's chest tightened. "He never told me money was a problem, because he didn't want to burden you with adult worries, but I could see the stress eating at him." Marcus met her eyes directly. "That's when I made him a proposal. I told him I'd take on extra work weekend cleaning contracts, overtime shifts, anything I could find. In exchange, he would put that money aside for your education." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. "No, that's not. Scholarship was from an anonymous foundation." "The Esperanza Foundation," Marcus said quietly. "Hope Foundation, named after Elena's middle name. Father created it with my help, funded entirely by the extra money I earned working 18-hour days. Every weekend for 4 years. I cleaned office buildings across the city while Alina underwent chemotherapy. All so you could have the opportunities, Rosa, and I could never give our own daughter." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Your wife, Alina, double quotes, died 6 months before you started college. She never got to see you succeed, but she was so proud when your father would tell us about your grades, your achievements. Marcus's voice remained steady, but Victoria could see the pain that still lived in his eyes after all these years. The last thing Alina made me promise was to watch over you and your father, to make sure you both stayed on the right path. Small break room felt suffocating. Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the single small window that looked out onto the building's loading dock. Why didn't anyone tell me? 'Cause your father made me swear never to let you feel indebted to anyone. He said your success had to be yours alone, or it wouldn't mean anything. Marcus wrapped up the remainder of his sandwich, but he also made me promise something else. He asked me to sit in that boardroom once a year, on the anniversary of Elena's death, and make sure his little girl was growing into the woman he raised her to be. Victoria turned back to face him, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. And what's your assessment? Marcus looked at her with infinite sadness. Today was the first time in 5 years that I questioned whether I was keeping my promise to Alina. Walls come tumbling down. Victoria returned to the 52nd floor in a daze. Marcus's words reverberating through her mind like aftershocks from an earthquake. The executive suite felt different. Now, larger, colder, more isolated than it had ever seemed before. She walked slowly through the empty corridors, past the awards and accolades that had once filled her with pride. Now, seeing them through different eyes, she found herself standing before the portrait of her father that hung outside the boardroom. Robert Sterling's painted eyes seemed to follow her, and for the first time in years, she truly studied his face. There was a gentleness there she had forgotten, a warmth that had somehow been lost in her memories of the driven businessman. Didn't know, Dad, she whispered to the portrait. Why didn't you tell me? The next morning brought an unusual request from James Crawford to meet early before the regularly scheduled board session. Victoria arrived to find not only James, but Patricia Hong and 3 other senior board members already seated around the conference table. The atmosphere was tense, formal. Victoria, we need to discuss yesterday's incident, James began without preamble. The way you handled the situation with the janitor has raised some concerns among the board. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table, her spine rigid. The situation was resolved. Marcus Webb is no longer employed by this company. That's precisely the problem, Patricia interjected, her usually diplomatic tone sharper than usual. Several of us witnessed your treatment of that man, and frankly, it was shocking. The cruelty was unnecessary and reflects poorly on this company's values. Cruelty? Victoria's voice rose defensively. He was trespassing in a restricted area before the most important meeting of the quarter. He was an elderly employee with over 2 decades of service, James said firmly. Whatever his reasons for being there, the situation could have been handled with more grace and dignity. The man appeared to be trying to explain himself. Victoria felt cornered, her carefully constructed professional facade beginning to crack. You don't understand. He claimed he had a right to be there, that he knew my father personally. It was inappropriate, and what if he did know your father? Patricia asked quietly. What if his claim was legitimate? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria looked around the table at faces she had worked alongside for years, seeing disappointment and concern in their expressions. These were people who had supported her rise to CEO, who had championed her leadership despite her youth. Victoria started, then stopped. The truth was too complex, too personal to explain in a boardroom full of executives who measured success solely in quarterly earnings and stock prices. Victoria, James said more gently, your father built this company on principles of respect and integrity. He treated every employee, from executives to maintenance staff, as valued members of the Sterling family. Yesterday's display was so contrary to those values that several board members questioned whether you truly understand what this company represents. The words hit Victoria harder than any financial loss or corporate setback ever could. Are you questioning my leadership? We're questioning whether the pressure of this position has changed you in ways that concern us, Patricia replied. The Victoria Sterling who started here 5 years ago would never have spoken to anyone the way you spoke to that man yesterday. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. They were right, and the realization was devastating. Somewhere along the path to proving herself worthy of her father's legacy, she had lost sight of the lessons he had actually tried to teach her. The merger was successful, she said weakly, grasping for solid ground. The merger was important, James acknowledged, but it's not the measure of who you are as a leader. Your father often said that how we treat the people who can do nothing for us reveals our true character. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering countless dinners where her father had shared similar wisdom lessons she had dismissed as outdated sentimentality in the harsh modern business world. There's something else, Patricia said hesitantly. After the incident yesterday, several of us did some research. Marcus Webb's personnel file shows he was personally hired by your father and has an exemplary record. He's worked every Christmas Eve for 20 years so that younger employees could be with their families. He's never taken a sick day, never filed a complaint, never asked for special treatment. Furthermore, James added, we discovered he's been quietly mentoring at-risk youth in Queens, helping them find honest work and stay in school. The man you humiliated yesterday has spent decades serving others with no recognition or fanfare. Victoria felt her world tilting on its axis. She thought she knew about success, about leadership, about herself, was crumbling around her. I want him reinstated immediately, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Patricia replied sadly. According to HR, Marcus Webb submitted his resignation this morning, effective immediately. 23 years of service. And he walked away without requesting any severance or benefits beyond what was legally required. The finality of it hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had driven away the one person who had truly known her father, who had sacrificed for her education, who had watched over her out of love rather than obligation. Where does he live? Victoria asked desperately. James exchanged glances with the other board members. Victoria, perhaps you should let this go. Some damage can't be undone. But Victoria was already standing, her mind racing with possibilities. No, some damage has to be faced, even if it can't be undone, especially then. For the first time in 5 years, Victoria Sterling left a board meeting without worrying about the impression she was making or the consequences for her career. She had more important things to do than protect her reputation. She had a promise to keep and a debt to acknowledge that was 23 years overdue. Finding home again, the apartment building in Queens was a far cry from the gleaming towers of Manhattan. Victoria stood outside the modest brick structure, her hands shaking as she clutched a folder containing documents she had spent the entire night preparing. The morning sun filtered through the trees lining the quiet street, and she could hear children playing in a nearby playground, sounds that seemed foreign after years of existing solely in sterile corporate environments. She climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, the scent of cooking spices and the distant sound of a television drifting through thin walls. When she reached apartment 3B, Victoria hesitated, her hand raised to knock. What could she possibly say that would undo the damage she had caused? The door opened before she could knock, revealing a young woman in scrubs with kind eyes that reminded Victoria immediately of Marcus. You must be Victoria Sterling, the woman said without surprise. I'm Rosa Webb, Marcus's daughter. He's been expecting you. Victoria followed Rosa into a small but immaculately clean living room. Family photographs covered every available surface: graduations, birthdays, holidays filled with genuine smiles. On the mantel sat a wedding photo of a younger Marcus with a beautiful woman who wore the same gentle expression Victoria remembered from her father's face. Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee. He had traded his janitor's uniform for a simple cardigan and slacks, but his dignified bearing remained unchanged. Please sit, he said, setting the tray on a worn coffee table. Rosa took the morning off from her shift at the hospital. She wanted to meet you. Victoria remained standing, overwhelmed by their calm reception. I came to apologize. Try to make things right, though I know that may be impossible. Dad told me what happened, Rosa said gently. But he also told me why it happened. You didn't know about the scholarship, did you? Victoria shook her head, tears beginning to blur her vision. I spent my whole life believing I had earned everything through my own merit. I was so arrogant, so convinced that my success proved my worth. Your success does prove your worth, Marcus said firmly. The money I earned paid for your education, but I couldn't give you intelligence, determination, or character. Those came from you and your father's guidance. See, Victoria's voice broke. While you were working 18-hour days to pay for my future, I was complaining about having to study for exams. While your wife was dying, I was worried about sorority parties and internship applications. I was living a life built on your sacrifice without ever knowing, never expressing gratitude. Never being asked to, Marcus interrupted quietly. That was the point, Victoria. Alina and I wanted you to have the freedom to be young, to make mistakes, to discover who you were meant to become without the weight of obligation crushing your spirit. Rosa leaned forward, her voice soft but clear. My mother used to say that. The greatest gifts are the ones given without expectation of recognition or return. She was proud to help make your dreams possible. Victoria finally sat down, her composure completely shattered. I don't deserve your kindness. Yesterday I was everything my father raised me not to be. Cruel, arrogant, dismissive of someone whose worth I couldn't even recognize. Marcus studied her face for a long moment. Your father used to worry about this, you know? He was afraid that success might harden you, that the corporate world might steal the compassionate girl he was raising. He was right to worry, Victoria whispered. Perhaps Marcus nodded. But he also believed that setbacks and mistakes could teach us who we really want to be. The question is, who do you want to be now? Victoria wiped her eyes and opened the folder she had brought. I want to be someone who honors the sacrifices made for her. Someone who remembers where she came from. She pulled out the first document. This is a reinstatement offer, with full back pay and benefits. But more than that, I want to create the Alina Webb Scholarship Foundation. A real foundation that will help children whose families are struggling just like ours were. Marcus looked surprised for the first time since she had arrived. There's more, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger. I want you to come back, not as a janitor, but as Director of Community Outreach. Help me identify families who need assistance, students who deserve opportunities, workers who should be treated with the dignity my father would have shown them. Rosa gasped softly, but Marcus remained thoughtful. Victoria, you don't need to create a job for me out of guilt. I'm not, Victoria said firmly. I'm asking you to help me remember who I'm supposed to be. To hold me accountable to the values my father tried to teach me and that you and Alina embodied every day. Marcus looked at the documents, then at his daughter, who nodded encouragingly. Alina always said that second chances are precious gifts, both for those who receive them and those who give them. Is that a yes? Victoria asked hopefully. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since this whole journey began. On one condition, every year, on the anniversary of Elena's death, you sit with me in that boardroom. Not as CEO and employee, but as two people remembering someone who believed in the power of quiet generosity. Victoria nodded through her tears. It would be an honor. 6 months later, Victoria stood before the same portrait of her father that had haunted her conscience. But now she saw something different in his painted expression. Not judgment, but patient love. The Alina Webb Scholarship Foundation had awarded its first grants to 12 deserving students. And Marcus had already identified 3 families, whose circumstances mirrored their own decades earlier. The executive floor still gleamed with corporate success, but they no longer felt cold. Victoria had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect through fear or maintaining distance from those she served. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person who walked through Sterling Enterprises' doors. And every evening, when the building grew quiet and the maintenance staff began their work, Victoria made it a point to walk the halls not as an executive inspecting her domain, but as Robert Sterling's daughter, finally understanding the difference between achievement and fulfillment, between success and significance. The promise had been kept. but more importantly, it had been transformed into something larger, a commitment. To ensure that no act of kindness, no matter how quiet, would ever go unrecognized again.